He thought it was just a storm. Then he saw the shapes, half-frozen bodies blinking in terror, and the word carved in the ice above them, LIARS, bloodline. Boone Mercer didn't believe in curses, but that day he started to. The first scream was so faint Boone thought it was wind threading through the canyon. But then came the second, sharper, thinner, and very human. He kicked his horse forward without a second thought, boots tight in the stirrups, rifle clattering against his saddlebag. Snow lashed sideways across his face, but he didn't flinch. Boone Mercer had ridden through worse than a storm. What he wasn't ready for was what he saw when he reached the clearing. There were 4 of them, girls, young, buried to their necks in snow-packed ground, their faces raw with cold, lips trembling blue. They blinked at him like creatures already halfway gone, each head poking out of a mound of crusted ice, the rest of their bodies hidden beneath. And carved into the thick wall of snow just behind them, letters large enough to fill the frozen bluff, the words, LIARS bloodline, cut deep, jagged, done with a knife or worse. Boone leapt down before his horse had stopped moving. "Don't move," he called, his voice steady despite the way his chest had seized. One of the girls, a little older than the others, maybe 15, tried to say something, but only a gurgled whisper came out. Boone dropped to his knees beside her, started digging with his hands, bare and numb. The snow was packed solid. It had taken time to get them like this, precision even. This wasn't some accident. Someone had meant to leave them there. Someone had wanted them found like this. He got the first girl loose enough to breathe. Her name came out weak but clear, June. She didn't know where they were. None of them did. They'd been brought in sacks, drugged, blindfolded. "They said we lied," she rasped. "Said our blood was wrong." Her eyes rolled back, and Boone caught her before her chin dropped into the snow. He couldn't dig them all out alone, not fast enough. Boone turned and fired 2 shots into the air. Echoes slammed off the ridge. Then he dragged his saddlebag free and yanked out his small axe, cutting into the packed ice. His horse stamped nervously behind him, nostrils flaring. The third girl, Mara, was barely conscious. The last, no older than 6, hadn't moved at all. It took him 45 minutes to get them all loose. By then his coat was soaked through and 2 fingers wouldn't bend right. He wrapped the youngest girl in his own duster and hauled her into his arms. He didn't care that the storm had turned into a full whiteout. The girls couldn't walk, couldn't ride. He'd have to carry them back, 2 trips if it came to it. He started with the youngest and June. The others he covered in what he could, prayed the coats and thick snow would buy him time. The ride back to his cabin was silent except for the wind and the shallow gasps against his chest. He didn't speak, just kept moving, one hand gripping the reins, the other holding the girls close. His cabin was 6 miles away, through trees, through frozen rivers, through wind sharp enough to skin. Boone didn't stop. He reached the cabin with his boots soaked, beard stiff with ice, and knees shaking like a drunk's. He kicked the door open and laid the girls down by the hearth. He built the fire until the chimney roared, stripped the wet clothes from the girls and wrapped them in every blanket he owned. Then he rode back for the others. By the time all 4 girls were inside and breathing, the snow had covered the prints at the crime scene. The carving in the ice would fade by morning, and Boone Mercer knew whoever had done this counted on that. They didn't think he'd find them. They didn't think the girls would live. They sure as hell didn't think Boone would come looking. But he would, because he recognized the name June, not from his own life, but from his late wife's stories. Boone had buried Rachel 6 winters ago. She had a half-sister she used to write to, always said her people out west were rough, wild, hard to pin down. She never said the name of the town, never said why she stopped writing. But the look on June's face when he mentioned Rachel was all he needed. "She's the one who said we had power," June had whispered, delirious. She told the truth. By morning, 2 of the girls were stable. The youngest, Tally, had a fever so high Boone could feel the heat through her blankets. He boiled snow, fed them weak broth, and tore pages from Rachel's old books to use as kindling when the logs got low. June wouldn't say much more, but Mara did, slowly, between fits of coughing and tears, and what she told Boone chilled him more than the snow ever could. "They said we came from cursed blood," she croaked. "Said women like us lie with our eyes. That truth was a man's job. They said we were born wrong. Boone asked who. Mara didn't know, only called them the judges, said they wore hoods, said they marked her with a hot nail just beneath the collarbone. Boone checked, there it was, a symbol he didn't recognize, carved and cauterized. He didn't say a word, just got up and stepped outside, the wind almost grateful for the silence he brought with him. In the distance, smoke curled where no homestead should have been, a thick black plume rising steady into the morning gray. Someone wasn't hiding, someone was taunting. Boone fed his horse, sharpened his axe, and reloaded his rifle. Inside, June stirred. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. They'll come back, they always do. Boone looked out at the dark horizon. Let him. But he didn't say what he was really thinking, that he had a name he hadn't spoken in 5 years, a name he thought had died when Rachel did, a name tied to pain, vengeance, and half the sins he'd buried behind him. And that name had just carved itself into the ice. Boone didn't sleep, not because he wasn't tired, he was exhausted, but because rest was a luxury you couldn't afford when evil knew your name. He sat by the hearth as the fire dimmed to coals, sharpening the same hunting knife he'd had since he was 19. Every scrape of the blade against stone was a thought he couldn't quite shake loose. The judges. That word alone twisted something deep in his gut, something older than law and colder than the wind outside. Mara's voice still echoed in his head, half broken. They said we came from cursed blood. That wasn't just cruelty, that was belief. The girls were asleep barely. June stirred often, caught in a half-dream where she called out names Boone didn't recognize. Mara flinched at shadows. Tally mumbled nonsense, caught between fever and nightmare. Boone had seen what hate could do, but this had a kind of doctrine behind it. Someone had made it feel righteous to hurt these children, and that more than anything chilled him. At dawn, he saddled the horse again. The sky was clean now, the storm having blown through like a beast sated. Snow hung from the trees, the kind that swallowed sound. Boone left a note scrawled on the back of a map for the girls. Don't open for anyone but me. If I'm not back by nightfall, take the horse and go east. Follow the river. He didn't say what they'd find east. He didn't know. He just couldn't let them stay defenseless while he rode toward the smoke. The black column was still rising from the ridge by mid-morning, and it wasn't until Boone came around the rock bend that he saw the source, a church, or at least something that used to be one. Whitewashed boards now scorched black. A steeple snapped clean in half. The windows had been covered with sheets of thick cloth, and Boone could smell something wrong underneath the smoke. Not just pine wood and ash, something fouler, something alive. He dismounted quietly, rifle in hand. The horse pawed at the ground, uneasy. Boone's boots sank into deep snow as he crept toward the broken steps. There were no voices, no sound, but the doors were ajar and fresh tracks led inside, a man's size, maybe 2, maybe more. Boone edged forward and stepped into the smoke. The inside was colder than outside. Someone had let the fire die down, but the heat remained trapped. And there in the center of the room was what used to be an altar. Now it was a table, blood-streaked, scarred, carved with symbols Boone didn't recognize. The whole room reeked of ritual, of judgment. And there, hanging on the back wall, a banner stitched by hand, words in red thread like veins. The pure shall speak, the rest shall freeze. Boone barely registered the footsteps behind him before the gun cocked. Cold metal met the back of his skull, and a voice, smooth, deliberate, spoke behind him. That's far enough. Boone didn't turn. You the one calling yourself judge? No. The man stepped into view, slow and tall and too clean for the place he was in. His beard was trimmed. His eyes were pale blue, almost silver. I'm one of many, and you are Boone Mercer. The name landing in that man's mouth made Boone flinch. We know your name, the judge continued. We know the women you kept company with, the lies they carried, the blood they passed down. Rachel Mercer may be in the ground, but her line continues. You shelter the children of false women, girls who pretend to be touched by spirit. They are not. They are touched by ruin. Boone moved faster than the man expected. The rifle butt slammed into his jaw, sending him sprawling across the blood-slick floor. The man's gun went off, but the shot went wild. Boone was on him in 2 strides, blade out, steel at the man's throat before he could scream. "You listen to me," Boone hissed. "I don't know what twisted scripture you worship, but those girls are under my roof. You come near them again, and I'll bury you so deep not even God will find you." The judge smiled, blood leaking from his lip. "They'll come anyway. You can't protect them all." Boone didn't kill him. Not because he didn't want to, but because this man wasn't the worst of them. Boone could smell it. This man took orders. There was someone worse pulling strings. So instead he hit him hard enough to crack bone, then tied his wrists with his own belt and dragged him outside. He was halfway through rigging a makeshift sled when he saw movement at the tree line. 3 figures, 2 on foot, 1 on horseback, watching, then gone. Boone finished tying the judge to the sled and kicked snow over the fire pit before heading back to the cabin, but the feeling stayed with him. He wasn't just being followed, he was being watched. When he reached the cabin, June was waiting with the rifle already loaded. "You said to open only for you," she said quietly. "So I asked what name Rachel used for you when she was mad." Boone smiled despite the knot in his chest. "Let me guess, hard-headed mule." "Swamp brain jackass," June corrected, but her mouth quirked. The smile didn't last. Boone brought the man inside, tied him to a beam, and stoked the fire again. The girls huddled in the far corner, their eyes wide. Tally hadn't improved. Boone set water to boil and crushed dry roots Rachel had stored years ago: willow bark, meadowsweet, painkillers, fever breakers, prayers made of leaves. That night the man spoke again. "You think you've saved them," he rasped, "but they were only the first." Boone didn't respond. "We're cleansing the land," he continued. "It's not murder, it's redemption." Boone walked over and knelt in front of him. "I'm going to give you 1 chance," he said. "1. The man grinned. "There are more girls buried right now. You'll never find them in time." And just like that, Boone's blood froze. The judge wouldn't say where, wouldn't say when, just smiled and closed his eyes like a man who thought dying was a ticket home. Boone tied a gag in his mouth and stepped outside. He didn't scream. He didn't curse. He just looked at the stars for a long, long time. By morning, he had a plan. June helped him draw the map, where they'd been taken from, what direction the wind had blown when they were tied up, how long the ride felt. She remembered a creek. Mara remembered bells. Boone marked every landmark in a 12-mile radius. He would find the rest. But the girls weren't safe in the cabin anymore. Not with strangers watching the trees, not with a judge under his roof. So he wrote another note, tucked it in June's coat. "Ride east. Stay quiet. Look for a man named Gable. Tall, bald, missing an eye. He owes me his life." Then he packed the girls into the sled, wrapped them in every quilt he had, and sent them off. He watched until they vanished over the ridge. Then he turned to the map, picked up the axe, and set out into the snow again. Because if there were more children buried out there, he wasn't going to wait for another scream to find them. Boone moved like a man being followed by his own grave. The snow was deep again, drifted over the lower trails like a second skin. Every mile sank into his knees, but he didn't slow. Guilt had a pace all its own, and Boone rode alongside it, sometimes ahead but mostly beneath it. The map was folded in the breast pocket of his coat, worn soft from the night he'd spent unfolding and refolding it by firelight. He didn't expect precision. He expected clues, crumbs. The kind of things only a child would remember: bells, shadows, how the cold felt on their necks before the pain came. That was what he hunted now. Pain with a direction. The first sign came at the base of a ravine. His horse shied and refused to take the slope. Boone dismounted, slipping once on a patch of ice thick enough to hold a man's weight, and caught himself on a low branch. Then he saw it. The earth looked wrong, uneven in a way that snow didn't usually lie. He pulled off his gloves and felt it, two indentations, side by side like shoulders had once been buried beneath them. He knelt. The ground gave a little, caved in just enough to show a darker slush beneath. He dug until his fingers struck fabric, a sleeve torn, no arm inside. But it hadn't been long, less than 2 days. They were moved, not killed here. Boone rose slowly and looked around. A narrow trail led west through a cut in the ridge. Something had been dragged that way, sled or body, he couldn't tell. He followed it. Past broken limbs, past hoofprints that had melted in yesterday's sun and refrozen crooked. He followed it to a clearing too symmetrical to be natural. It was there he found the second altar. This one was made of stone, not carved, stacked, meticulously. Boone stepped into the clearing with his rifle low and his breath caught tight in his throat. The stones were slick with ice, but even through it he saw the stains. Dried blood, old but not ancient. Something had been sacrificed here. Boone's hand twitched toward the small silver cross Rachel had worn once. He didn't pray, hadn't in years, but it hung from his belt like a memory that refused to stay buried. On the tallest stone, a sign. Wooden, scorched around the edges, nailed with thick square pegs. It read, "Silence BIRTHS sin." Beneath it, scorched brands, 4 symbols Boone recognized from the cabin and one new one. A circle split by a single line. He didn't understand the meanings, but he understood what they meant, escalation. The judges weren't just punishing girls. They were preaching while they did it. And someone in this territory was letting them, maybe helping them. Boone left the altar behind, careful not to step too close. He rode west another hour before finding the next clue, burned bark, pine stripped of needles, a blackened horseshoe half buried in slush. And finally he saw the cabin. Not his, not anyone's anymore. It leaned like it wanted to collapse, roof half sunken in, chimney split, but there was smoke rising from a pit out back. That meant recent use. Boone approached slow, rifle tight in his hands. He circled wide, boots crunching just enough to announce himself without being careless. Then he heard it, a cough. Low, weak but human. He found her behind the cabin, lying half under a tarp. The girl couldn't have been older than 11. Her hands were bound, feet purple from frostbite. Boone knelt beside her, not touching yet. She flinched anyway. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said slow. Her lips trembled. She blinked snowflakes off her lashes and said, "They said if I made a sound, God would burn me clean." Boone swallowed hard. "What's your name?" She shook her head. "Don't got one anymore." He pulled the tarp back, untied her wrists. The skin beneath was raw. She hissed but didn't cry. That told him everything. She'd already spent those tears. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I don't remember how," she whispered. Boone picked her up. She weighed less than a sack of feed, and her bones felt like twigs wrapped in damp linen. He took her to the horse, bundled her as best he could, and tied her tight to the saddle. Then he turned back and lit the cabin on fire. It went fast. The flames caught the dry timbers like they'd been waiting for him, and the smoke climbed into the sky like a signal no one would dare misread. He rode all night. She spoke only once more before dawn. "They said the other girls were liars, that I was the last true one." Boone didn't ask what that meant. He didn't want her to repeat the words they drilled into her bones. He just tightened his hold and whispered, "Not anymore." He reached Gable's outpost by midday. Just one shack with a forge and a root cellar, but it was enough. Gable opened the door and stared at Boone like he'd seen a ghost. "Hell, Mercer, thought you were dead." "Not yet," Boone muttered, dismounting with the girl still in his arms. "Need shelter, got more coming. You still got that rifle?" Gable nodded, one eye missing, a scar down to his jaw, but he hadn't lost his edge. "Still loaded. What the hell is this?" Boone didn't answer. He carried the girl inside and set her near the fire, wrapped her in furs, and handed Gable the letter he'd written for June. "3 girls," he said, "coming from the ridge. If they ain't here by tomorrow, ride east till you find 'em." Gable read the note, nodded once. "What about you?" "I'm going back out," Boone said. "You're bleeding." Boone looked down. He hadn't even noticed the gash in his thigh. Didn't matter, not now. "I'll stitch it later," he said. "There's more out there." Gable grunted. "You're gonna die for this." Boone looked at the girl by the fire. She was asleep already, lips twitching like she was still in a dream she couldn't wake from. "Better men than me already have," Boone said. He left before dusk, rode with a second wind no man should have found, and when he crested the next hill he saw what he hadn't dared hope for, June's coat, flapping on a post outside a different cabin, a signal, a warning, or a trap. Boone rode hard, not slowing even when the trail narrowed to a choke point. He slammed into the clearing just as 3 men in hoods stepped out from behind a stack of firewood. Guns raised. One fired. Boone dropped sideways from the saddle, rolled, and fired twice before he hit the ground. 1 man fell. The second shot missed. The third judge closed in with a knife, but Boone met him with the rifle barrel and shattered his jaw with a single swing. The last man dropped his gun. "Don't shoot," he croaked. "I can tell you where they are, more girls." Boone leveled the barrel, "Then talk fast." "They're at the basin," the man gasped. "Cave above the lake, 6 girls, chained. Said they were born from the wrong blood, said." Boone pulled the trigger, not to kill, but close enough to end the confession. He left the man crying in the snow and rode harder than he had all winter. Because the basin was half a day away. And every hour meant a girl might not make it. By the time Boone reached the edge of the basin, his horse was lathered in foam and he'd lost all feeling in his left hand. The cold was thick again, returning with that sudden, cruel finality winter sometimes had, like it resented being beaten back for even a day. The canyon sloped low here, surrounded by bluffs sharp enough to cut sky, and somewhere above them, hidden in the folds of stone and shadow, was a cave. Not a shelter, not a haven, a prison. And if the man Boone had left crying in the snow hadn't lied, there were 6 girls inside it, still alive, but not for long. He tethered the horse beneath a frozen pine, checked his rifle, then his revolver, then the hunting knife sheathed in the side of his boot. He didn't expect a firefight. What he expected was worse. Men who didn't need weapons to kill. Men who killed with words, with silence, with ritual. The kind who made girls into warnings. The kind who buried them to the neck and called it scripture. The first 100 yards were steep, loose shale beneath snow, impossible to walk without slipping. Boone crawled on hands and knees, breath misting the stone, moving like he was part of the cliff itself. He reached a ledge and waited, ears straining against the wind. Nothing. Then he saw it smoke again. Not much. A thin ribbon slipping out from the cracks of a ridge above, nearly invisible against the rock, but enough. The cave was real. He found the entrance by accident. It wasn't wide, just a narrow slit between boulders, half covered by a wool blanket strung up to block the draft. The smell hit him first. Not rot, not blood, something worse. Unwashed bodies, fear, the kind of scent that clung to hair and skin and never quite left. Boone pulled the blanket aside and slipped inside. Darkness swallowed him whole. He moved slow, boots muffled against dirt and straw. His fingers brushed the wall, raw stone, rough-hewn, then voices. Low, chanting, not English, not Latin, something older. Boone pressed forward. The tunnel widened and glowed faintly ahead. Firelight flickered, casting shadows like claws, and in the center of the cavern there they were. 6 girls, chained by the wrists to wooden posts driven into the stone. Their heads were bowed, some unconscious, some weeping. Symbols were painted on their foreheads in what looked like soot or blood. Boone didn't count how many men stood guard, just how far apart they were, how slow they moved, how lazy hate made them when they thought no one was watching. He picked the one closest to the girls, slipped behind him, one hand on the mouth, the knife through the ribs. No scream, just a gasp and a slump. The second man never even turned before Boone's revolver barked once, echoing like thunder off the cave walls. The chanting broke. Panic. One of the judges raised a torch and saw Boone, screamed something. Two more ran toward him. Boone fired again. One dropped. The other ducked behind a post. Boone moved. Fast. Fire in his knees, blood roaring in his ears, he covered the distance in 4 strides and tackled the man head-on, slamming his head into the wall until the chanting stopped for good. Then silence. The girls whimpered. Boone dropped the revolver and yanked the first set of chains loose with the back end of his rifle. Rusted links. Easy to break if you knew where to hit. The girls were too weak to stand, so he worked one by one, freeing wrists, wrapping shoulders in his coat, his shirt, anything. "Can you walk?" he asked the oldest, a girl with short black hair and sunken cheeks. She nodded, barely. "Good, help the others." He scanned the room. No more movement, no more threats. Then he saw it painted across the far wall in thick, uneven script, "The pure shall rise." Beneath it something newer, scratched in haste, "Boone Mercer." They knew, not just who he was, that he was coming, that he'd been part of this longer than he realized. One of the girls tugged his sleeve. "You're bleeding." Boone looked down. The gash in his thigh had reopened. He tightened his belt above the wound, teeth gritted, and lifted the smallest girl into his arms. Time to go. They didn't run. Couldn't. They moved like ghosts, stumbling out into the frost-heavy night, the blanket flapping behind them as the cave fell dark once more. Boone brought them to a ridge where he'd left the horse. 5 girls on foot, one in his arms. No way to carry them all, not fast enough, not with blood dripping into his boot. He built a sled from fallen branches lashed with rawhide from the rains. It took 30 minutes too long, and just as he was loading the girls in, he heard it, hoofbeats, fast, not one, several men, armed. Boone didn't think. He cut the horse free and slapped its flank, sending it careening down the slope with the girls huddled in the sled behind it. Then he turned and drew his rifle. They came in hard, 4 men, 2 rifles, 1 shotgun, 1 revolver. Boone dropped the first with a clean shot to the chest. The second returned fire, missing wide. Boone ducked and rolled, came up behind a stump and fired again. The shotgun man caught it in the leg, screamed, dropped his weapon. Boone ran at the last, tackled him mid-stride. The man clawed at his face, teeth snapping, and Boone drove his elbow down into his windpipe. Silence. Again. Boone stood shaking, blood in his mouth and smoke on his coat. His thigh burned like fire, but the girls were safe for now. He limped back toward the trail, followed the sled tracks, found the horse an hour later, tired but alive, standing near a frozen stream. The girls were huddled beneath pine boughs, half asleep. He didn't cry. Boone didn't cry, but something broke open in his chest then. Something he'd buried the day Rachel died. He knelt, pulled them into his arms one by one, and whispered their names until they knew they still had them. The ride back to Gable's outpost took 2 days. By then, snow had covered most of the blood. But not all of it. And when Boone opened the door and saw June and Mara and Tally sitting by the fire, safe, whole, he finally let the cold catch up to him. He dropped to his knees and passed out on the floor. He woke to pain and the smell of pine pitch. Gable sat at his side, stitching his thigh with fishing line. "You're a dumb bastard," he muttered. "Ain't no sane man rides into a storm for a bunch of strangers." "They're not strangers," Boone rasped. "No. They're Rachel S.," he whispered. Gable didn't ask what that meant, just nodded and kept stitching. The next day, word reached them. Another child had been found, this time in Millstone, buried to her shoulders, alive, but barely. The note carved above her didn't say "Liars, Bloodline." It said, "Bring Mercer." Boone sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the flames. They weren't done. Not yet. They came for him before dawn. Gable was outside hauling water when he saw the tracks, 12 horses at least, all heading south along the creek bed, their prints fresh, no more than an hour old. That was how they moved now, in silence, in numbers, and in plain sight, because they knew Boone Mercer would come. They didn't have to hunt him. They just had to keep leaving signs, girls, names, blood. And now they had left one more, barely alive, carved into the snow like a question only he could answer. Bring Mercer. Boone was on his feet by mid-morning. The wound in his leg hadn't closed right, but it didn't matter. The ache behind his ribs was worse. That ache had a name, Rachel, and now it echoed in every scream, every frozen hand he pulled from the snow. These girls weren't just victims, they were echoes of her, of the world that let her die, of the man he used to be before he buried her and her secrets together. "Millstone's 3 days if you ride straight," Gable said, tossing a saddlebag across the horse's flank. "Less if you cut through Ghost Rock, but you'll wish you hadn't." Boone didn't flinch. "Ghost Rock's fine, I'm not sleeping anyway." Gable stepped back, wiping his hands on his coat. "You should leave the girls here. Ain't no good dragging them into whatever this is becoming." "I'm not dragging them anywhere," Boone said quietly. "They asked to stay." And they had. June, firm-jawed and steady now, had looked him in the eye and said, "You'll need someone who sees what you miss." Mara had nodded beside her. Even Tally, who barely spoke, had sat beside the map and traced her fingers over the rivers like she was learning where her nightmares ended. So Boone left them in Gable's care, promised he'd return, and rode out alone. He reached Ghost Rock by dusk. The old mining trail wound like a snake between cliffs, the kind of narrow pass where you couldn't see what waited above. It had been abandoned 20 years ago when the mine collapsed, but the dead didn't stop whispering just because no one listened. Boone knew the stories. Men buried alive, heard pounding on stone for days. Some said they were still down there. Not bodies, souls. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in what people did when they thought the land itself wanted them gone. Halfway through the pass, he saw movement, just a flicker, a flash of red cloth behind a rock. Boone pulled up, rifle out. "I see you," he called. "Step out slow." The boy couldn't have been older than 12. Pale, freckled, eyes wide with something more than fear. His coat was too big, sleeves torn, and he carried no weapon, just a length of rope looped around one wrist like a leash. Boone dismounted. "What's your name?" The boy didn't answer, just looked past him, toward the shadows behind the rocks. Boone turned just as the shot rang out. It caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him backward. The rifle flew from his hands, clattering across the frozen ground. Pain like fire bloomed down his chest, but Boone didn't fall. He never did. He lunged instead, straight at the shooter. The man stepped from the rocks, already chambering another round. Boone hit him like a bear, driving them both into the snow. The gun fired into the sky, and Boone slammed his elbow into the man's throat once, twice, until he went still. Another shape moved behind him. Boone grabbed the rifle, rolled, and fired. The bullet took the second man through the leg, dropped him screaming. The boy ran. Boone let him. He stood, panting, shoulder slick with blood, staring down at the man he'd wounded. "How many?" The man spit blood. "Enough." Boone raised the barrel. "Where?" "You can't stop it," the man rasped. "She's already picked the next one." Boone blinked. "She?" The man smiled. "Judge isn't a man." And that was the moment something cold uncoiled in Boone's chest, a truth he hadn't let himself consider. He'd always pictured the men who did this as just that, men, weak, angry, dogmatic. But if the rot ran deeper, if the mind behind this wore a woman's face, it meant something else entirely. He left the man bleeding, not dead but close, and rode hard toward Millstone. The town looked different than he remembered, quieter, not with the hush of peace but the silence of something held too long in the mouth. Shops were shuttered. No one moved on the main road. Even the saloon stood empty, door creaking with wind. Boone dismounted at the church. It was the only place with lights still burning. He pushed open the door. And there she was. Not the judge, not yet, but the girl. 9 years old, Buried to the neck in a snowdrift behind the rectory, her mouth blue, her eyes shut. A single breath still left in her lungs. The townsfolk had found her just minutes before Boone arrived. She'd been tied there all night. Above her, carved into the ice wall behind the drift, words deep enough to gleam. LIARS bloodline. Again. He lifted her out himself, carried her inside, wrapped her in furs, and sat by the stove until her lips turned pink again. She opened her eyes once, said, "Rachel," then fell back into sleep. Boone didn't move. Not for a long time. The sheriff came at dusk, an old man with one eye and no teeth. He looked tired. "You're the Mercer boy, ain't you?" he asked, sitting beside the stove. Boone nodded. "Your mother," the sheriff said, "she ever tell you what Rachel did?" Boone didn't answer, just stared into the fire. The sheriff sighed. "She used to say she heard voices, said they told her where the sick would fall, where the wind would break the bridges. And sometimes she was right, too right. Folk got scared, said she was a witch, said her children would carry the curse." Boone looked at the girl sleeping in the cot. She didn't have children. The sheriff's mouth tightened. "No," he said, "but she had a sister." Boone froze. "What?" "Ran off when she was 16, pregnant." Boone stared at him. The words slid around his skull like knives. "What was her name?" The sheriff looked away. "Margaret." It hit Boone like a flood. Rachel's voice all those years ago. "Some things I carry that ain't mine." Margaret, pregnant, gone. And if Rachel raised the girl as her own, if Margaret's child lived? Boone stood, blood rushing like a river inside him. Because he suddenly knew what this was. Not a ritual. Not a doctrine. A vendetta. Someone believed Rachel's line carried lies. Someone wanted to end it. And they didn't know the difference between Margaret and Rachel, between Boone and whoever Margaret's child had been. He left the church, heart thundering. Because if the judge wasn't a man, if this went back to Margaret, then there was only one place left to look. The ruins of the old homestead. Rachel's birthplace. Margaret's too. It was 10 miles north, forgotten by most, but Boone remembered. He'd never been, but Rachel used to speak of it like a scar she couldn't cover, a place with no warmth, no forgiveness. He rode through the night, shoulders stiff, heart hammering. Because if the judge was waiting, if this was blood calling to blood, then he had to answer. The trail to the old homestead had been swallowed long ago, by time, by weather, by the world's desperate effort to forget the place ever existed. But Boone found it. Memory was stubborn that way. It led him past crumbled fences and rust-warped gates, through thickets that reached like hands across the path, snagging at his coat and face like they recognized his blood and wanted it returned. The moon hung low behind banks of cloud, offering just enough light to make the shapes ahead seem like half-formed memories, walls, a stone chimney, a well. And there, crooked against the hillside like a corpse mid-prayer, was the house. Rachel's birth house. Margaret's too. It was more ruin than dwelling now, bones of timber left to rot beneath moss and frost. But Boone knew better than to think it abandoned. This place was alive in the way only cursed land could be. It breathed under the snow. It watched. And somewhere inside he knew she was waiting, the judge. The voice behind it all. The one who carved girls into the land and called it cleansing. Boone dismounted, wincing as his shoulder tugged with the movement. Blood had dried down the sleeve and frozen stiff. He ignored it. This wasn't a night for bleeding. It was a night for reckoning. He slung his rifle, drew the revolver, and stepped toward the house. The front door was gone. Wind moved through the entryway like breath, low and steady. Inside, the hearth was cold, but the ashes were recent. A fire had burned here not long ago. And near the center of the floor, where the planks had buckled from time and damp, someone had cleared a space, made a circle, salt, bones, something old and dead hanging from a length of twine. Boone stepped around it. The back room was where he found her. Not the judge, not yet, but the girl. Older than the others, 17 maybe. Her hair was long, dark with soot. Her dress was torn down the side. She was tied to a beam with her arms stretched above her, mouth gagged, eyes glassy, but alive. Boone moved fast, knife to the rope, catching her as she slumped forward. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe." She looked at him, then past him, and her whole body shook. Behind him, a voice. "Is she?" Boone turned. The woman stood in the doorway like she'd always belonged there. Not tall, not young, but her presence filled the room like a winter gale. She wore black, sleeves tight to the wrist, buttons done high to the throat. Her hair was silver at the roots but braided back with deliberate care. Her eyes, Rachel's eyes. Boone felt the truth before she spoke it. "You're Margaret," he said. She nodded once. "I was." The girl in his arms whimpered. Boone pulled her closer. "Why?" Margaret stepped into the room, slow, deliberate. Because the blood never stops lying. Rachel thought she could outrun it, thought she could raise me right, protect me from what ran in our veins, but lies fester, and every girl born with it has the same sickness, the same curse. "She tried to help you," Boone said, voice low. "She made me forget who I was." Margaret's voice shook then, just for a moment, like grief had nearly found her, but it passed. Her face smoothed, hardened. "I remembered when the fever came, when the visions returned, when the voice told me why my mother bled to death in the snow screaming Rachel's name, because she stole my place, because she thought she knew better than God." Boone rose slowly, the girl still tucked against him. "You hurt children." "I saved them," Margaret whispered, "from what they were becoming." "No," Boone said, "you made them into you." Margaret smiled. And from behind the wall, 4 others stepped out. Women all dressed the same, all older, weathered. The ones he thought were men, the ones who'd done the burying, the branding, the carving, they were hers, her judges, disciples in mourning clothes. Boone raised the revolver. "You'll need more than that," Margaret said. One of the women lunged. Boone fired once. She dropped. Another moved. He shot again. Chaos erupted. Screams. Smoke. The girl tore free from his grasp and crawled beneath the table. Boone swung the revolver like a club and cracked another judge's jaw. Someone grabbed his wounded arm. He drove a knee into her ribs and turned the barrel toward Margaret. She didn't move. Boone hesitated. And that was enough. The last judge slammed into him from behind. The revolver flew. He hit the ground, ribs crunching against the beam. Cold hands found his throat. His vision blurred. Then light. Blazing. The wall behind Margaret exploded inward with the crack of a rifle. "Gable." The old man stood in the snow, shotgun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. And beside him, June. Then Mara. Then Tally. They came like ghosts returning to their graves. June fired again. A clean shot. Another judge fell. Boone rolled, found the revolver, fired into the chest of the woman who had him pinned. Then it was quiet. Smoke drifted in the rafters. One of the girls sobbed. Gable limped forward, eyes hard. "I told you not to die," he muttered, helping Boone up. Margaret was gone. The back door swung wide into the night. Tracks in the snow, light footprints, swift. Boone didn't hesitate, he followed. The trail led into the woods behind the house. Pines closed and fast, branches low with ice. Boone moved through them like a blade, ducking, sliding, ignoring the pain in his chest. He saw her ahead, Margaret running, still fast after all these years, but not fast enough. He tackled her by the creek. They hit the ground together, rolling. She lashed out with nails. He blocked. She tried to claw his eyes. He caught her wrists. "Look at me," he hissed. She wouldn't. "Look at me." Finally she did. And in those eyes he saw it, not madness, Fear. She shook beneath him. It's in me, she whispered. I hear it every night, screaming. I thought if I made it stop, if I silenced the others, maybe I could. You could what? Boone said. Bury the blood. She nodded. Before it becomes you. Boone stared down at her. And something broke. Not in her. In him. Because he realized it wasn't power that drove her. It wasn't even revenge. It was grief, pure, twisted, devouring. And maybe that made it worse. Boone stood. You're not Rachel, he said. Margaret curled into the snow. You never were, he whispered. He didn't kill her. Didn't need to. She was already buried in the one place you never dig out of, your own mind. He left her there. Walked back to the ruins. The girls were waiting. Gable, too, leaning on the shotgun like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Boone stood in the doorway, looking at the wreckage, the circle of bones, the blood, the black salt on the floor. He reached down and kicked it apart. Then he walked out into the wind and let it take the last of Rachel's past with it. There was still a part left to tell. Still one more road. Still one more truth to unearth. And Boone Mercer wasn't done. Not yet. They rode before dawn, the wind a sharp breath through pine and ash, scattering frost like ash across the trail. Boone didn't speak, didn't need to. The girls followed in silence, wrapped in wool and borrowed courage, their eyes fixed ahead, not to flee what they'd seen, but to face what still lay ahead. Gable rode behind, shotgun across his lap, his jaw clenched tight. They left the ruins behind them like a wound finally stitched shut, but the healing was still far off, and Boone knew this wasn't the end of the path. Margaret hadn't followed. She hadn't moved at all, not since curling into the snow with that look in her eyes, the kind that said she'd buried herself long before Boone ever tackled her. Gable had asked if they should take her in. Boone just shook his head. Some people never leave the prisons they build inside themselves. The worst punishment was being forced to live in it. They reached Millstone by nightfall. The sheriff waited on the edge of town, shoulders hunched beneath his coat. When he saw the girls, he took off his hat and held it to his chest. God in heaven, he muttered. Boone nodded toward the youngest, the one from behind the church. She's still sleeping. The sheriff nodded. Mostly, Doc says she'll live, can't say much more than that, won't talk. She doesn't need to yet, Boone said, just needs time. The town opened its arms, quietly, cautiously. Doors that had been bolted reopened. Bread was brought, quilts. A fire was lit in the old Grange hall, and the girls, Mara, June, Tally, and the rest, were given space, food, warmth. No questions, not yet. But Boone stayed outside. He sat by the fence with Gable as the stars came out. His shoulder ached like fire. His ribs hadn't stopped screaming, but that wasn't what kept him from sleep. Margaret knew Rachel was dead, he said at last. Gable chewed a piece of straw, figured. But she kept going, even after the last girl, even after she said the blood had run its course. Gable waited. Boone looked out toward the hills. Means she wasn't just trying to end a line, she was building something. You think it's still going? I think there's more we don't see. And he was right. Because the next morning, while the girls were still asleep and the sun hadn't yet burned through the fog, a man arrived at the edge of town. He wore a long coat, boots dusted in frost, a hat too clean for this part of the country. But it was his eyes that made Boone's stomach turn, not sharp, not cruel, but empty. Like he'd never known loss, never tasted it, just watched others starve on it and took notes. He asked for Boone by name. The sheriff fetched him. Boone found the man leaning against the post outside the telegraph office, a notebook in one hand, a tin flask in the other. You Mercer? Boone didn't answer. The man smiled, small, polite. Name as Silas Alden. I write for the Fortnight Review. Heard you been digging up girls in the snow. Sounded like a story. Boone said nothing. Silas pushed off the post and strolled a little closer. I came through Bitter Hollow, funny town, whole place empty, heard some strange things, saw some stranger ones, letters carved in doors, symbols on trees. You know anything about that? Why are you here? Boone asked. Silas tapped his notebook. I follow stories, this one led me to you. This one's over. I don't think it is, Silas said calmly. I think you've only cut off one head. Boone's jaw tightened. Silas leaned in, voice lower. You ever heard of the Bleeding Choir? Boone froze. Because Rachel had said those words once, long ago, when the fever had taken her in the winter and she'd spoken in sleep. The Bleeding Choir sings beneath the snow. Don't listen to them, Boone. They'll find your name. Boone stepped forward. You working with them? Silas's eyes twitched just slightly. No, he said, but I think you are. The world slowed. Boone didn't draw his gun. Didn't move. Just stared. You're wrong, he said. Silas smiled again. We'll see. He tipped his hat and walked away, notebook tucked into his coat like a secret. That night Boone didn't sleep. He sat by the hearth with the girls curled nearby, watched the shadows lengthen on the walls and thought about blood. Not just Rachel's, not just Margaret's, his own. What flowed in it, what echoed down it. He stopped one storm. But others gathered. The next morning, the girl who had barely spoken, who'd been buried behind the church with LIARS bloodline above her, came to Boone quietly. She took his hand. Do you hear them too? She asked. Boone looked down at her, then past her to the woods, and listened. In the wind faint far off, there was a sound. Soft, like singing. He closed his eyes. And the last line Rachel had ever whispered to him, the one she said with frost on her lips, echoed in his skull like a curse. You weren't made to survive this, Boone. You were made to end it. He rose. The wind blew harder. And somewhere beyond the valley, deeper than any cave or ruin, something stirred. The story wasn't over. It was only just beginning.